Hello guys, welcome to DevOps Easy Learning. My name is Eric Patterson. Today I will walk you through Docker Compose. It's just going to be a quick introduction to Docker Compose. Then after we're going to do a practice. So let's start. What is Docker Compose? Now, a good question that we need to ask is what is Docker Compose? And we can say that Docker Compose is a build tool that defines multiple containers like Docker Compose is actually a tool owned by Docker that allow us to spin multiple containers. We have seen Docker before. We have noticed that in Docker, we can only spin one container at a time by using Docker Run. Docker Run doesn't allow us to spin more than one container. But in Docker Compose, we are able to spin multiple containers at a time, and this tool is very handy especially in the development area, and also it's used also in production area. It saves time a lot. When you have like multiple container you want to set the spin at the same time, Docker Compose will be a handy tool that will allow you to go ahead and spin all those containers at the same time. Now, Docker is a great tool, like I mentioned earlier, no doubt. Docker is a very great tool, but it has some limitation here. I want to emphasize on it. With Docker, you can only spin one container at a time. And with Docker Compose, it's great because you can spin multiple containers at the same time. Now, there's one problem that we're facing in the industry is that most of the time, it's true that with Docker, you can quickly deploy like an HTTPD application, but most of the application that we use in industry are actually microservice. They're applications that are not only made on a single container, but they are actually applications that are made with multiple container. And when an application is made with multiple container, we call that microservice, right? And every single container here will be called a service, right? When we're talking about, we say container or service, at the end of the day, it's the same thing. So that's a huge problem, right? Most of the application, they are made of multiple container. Docker only allow us to spin one container. What if we have a microservice, which we just say is also an application that run on multiple container? So that's one of the limitations that Docker has. Now, for example, right? Let's take an example that we have a little application, right? A little shopping microservice application. So what's going to happen is that let's imagine that microservice has like a account service. So one container handle the account service portion, the other container handle the product catalog, another container handle the cart server, and we have another container that actually handle the other server. Now, what is going to happen is that with Docker, we are going to spin the account service first. That will be one Docker run command. Then we are going to spin the product catalog. That's going to be another one Docker run command. And we are going to spin another service. That's going to be another Docker run command, which here is going to be the cart service. And we are going to spin another service, which is another container, the other service. That's another Docker run command. As you guys notice, it took us 4 Docker run commands to go ahead and run this. Now, by using Docker Compose, it's a bit different. If we have to deploy this with Docker Compose, we are going to spin all containers at the same time. So with Docker Compose, we will go ahead and spin all containers at the same time, which is really handy compared to Docker where we have to spin a container at a time. With Docker Compose, we are going to go ahead and spin all containers at the same time. So Docker Compose is very handy in this configuration. Now, Docker Compose uses a language called YAML. YAML is actually the language that Docker Compose use. And this is, for example, a sample Docker Compose. So as you guys can see, it actually uses a YAML language. So, and you have to respect the syntax, which we are going to see on the slide coming in a few minutes. Now, there are some elements that you need to know in Docker Compose. Let's talk about the structure, for example, on Docker Compose. Docker Compose has a structure. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of Docker Compose. Now, in Docker Compose, we are going to have a version, and that version is required. So we are going to have a version, and that version is required, meaning that every single Docker Compose required a version. The version is really important in Docker Compose because sometimes, depending on the version of Docker Compose, that will dictate, for example, an element that you will use in order in what is called a service, right? So, and also it depends, like Docker dropped some stuff a few years ago, links, which Docker doesn't use no more. But if you are not using the correct, let's say you are using the latest version of Docker, link is useless to you. But if you are using like old version of Docker, you may have to use links. So that's a version. And I want you guys to pay attention here because this is how it's written. It is version, colon, then the version number. So version, colon, then the version number. Now, another element that is part of the structure of Docker Compose is the service. And the service is actually mandatory. It is required. So you are required to have a service. So every single Docker file is going to have service. And that's how the service look like. As you guys can see right now, we have the version and we have the service. We say service or container, right? The service actually represents a container, right? A service will spin a container at the end of the day. As when we get to the practice, you will see the service actually represents the container. So now we have another portion called the declaration, and the declaration is optional. So we have the declaration in Docker Compose, and that declaration is optional. I'm saying that the declaration is optional. Why? Because it will depend. You don't always use the declaration. You will do the declaration under certain condition. Not all Docker files have the declaration, but in every single Docker file, you will need the version, you will need the service, and you may not need the declaration. For example, when we go deeper, you will understand the meaning of declaration. Now, let's take time to go ahead and dig a little bit through the version. Like I mentioned before, the version is mandatory. The question now is that how do we set the version in Docker Compose? To set a version in Docker Compose, you can go to this link. I will put that on the video so that you can click on it. So this document comes from Docker, and that is where all the versions are set. Now, the version actually depends on the version that you are going to use on your Docker Compose file. Now, it depends on the version of Docker that you have installed, Docker engine, for example. If you want to run if you want to set your version to 3.8, you need at least Docker version 19.30 and more. So you don't just wake up in the morning and just put anything in your Docker Compose file. So be mindful that the version on your Docker Compose file depends on the version of the Docker engine that you have. If you want to know the version of the Docker that you are using, you can type the command docker -- version, and you'll be able to see the version of the Docker that you are using. So it's really important. So the version that we set in our Docker Compose file now is dictated by what? By the version of the Docker engine that we have installed. Another important element on the version is that you need to pay attention. Now, the version number is quote. The version number is quote. You can either use double quote or you can use single quote. If you don't put the quote, it will fail. So Docker will fail if you don't put the quote. So always make sure that you quote the version number. You can either use double quote or you can either use single quote. Both of them will work. Now, talking again about the service, let's try to construct a little Docker Compose file with the version and the service. So we are going to go ahead, for example, and set our version to 3.8. After the version, we are going to go ahead and put the service. I want you to pay attention. Version and service are actually, they have the same identification. They are always at the same level. They always have the same identification here. Then after that, we are going to call the service name. So after the service, we are going to call the service name. Then after the service name, we are going to call the image, right? We're going to call the image. I mentioned earlier that a service is actually a container, and for you to spin a container up, you need an image. That is why here you see the image. Now, we can define another service called DB, and it's going to have an image also. Why? Because a service represents a container. We can define another front service, which is going to come with its own image, and we can define another one, and so forth. So a service will need at least an image, and you can have multiple services. But pay attention here. I want us to see a couple of elements. The service and the version are at the same level. But if you look at the services like app, DB, front, and API, they are actually on the same level, meaning that service is the parent, app, DB, front, and API are actually children. As you can see here, this image colon Redis is actually the children of app, and this one is for DB, this one is for front, and this one is for API. The last one is to check, which is just another service. We are going to keep digging in the structure. So now let's construct, for example, let's go ahead and construct another Docker Compose file. So that's a Docker Compose file. As you guys can see here, it's a Docker Compose file which has we have the image, we call the port on each one, and we call the network. Now, I want us to pay attention to something. Like I mentioned earlier, as you can see, the version and the service are actually on the same level. So version and service, they have the same identification. Then, followed by the services, app, DB, front, API, and check. They are actually services, and they should be at the same alignment. They should have the same alignment. Same as the version and service have the same alignment. All services, if you are familiar with YAML, right? If you are familiar with YAML, all services, all services, we actually have the same alignment, right? The same alignment here. Now, I also want you to pay attention into the element of the services, right? Element of services always have the same alignment, right? Element of services always have the same alignment. As you can see here, the element for app have the same alignment. The element for DB have the same alignment. The element for front has the same alignment. The element for API have the same alignment. And the element for check have the same element. So it is very important because this is YAML, and we mentioned that Docker Compose is written in YAML. So it is very important that you pay attention to the alignment. So one more time, the version and the service have the same alignment. All services keep the same alignment, and element under the service actually keep the same alignment. Now, I want you to pay attention to something. You can either, for example, when it comes to this list, you can either put one of your service like this. You have app, image, port. If you want to define the list of port, you can put your hyphen here, or you can put it like this. It's the same thing. It is either you move this hyphen to where port start, or you keep it after. Both of them are the same. So you might see some Docker Compose file which have this structure, and some Docker Compose file which has this structure. At the end of the day, it is the same thing. Now, let's keep digging into service. Now, required element of the service. What are the elements that are required under the service? Or when I say element, I will call them option, right? What are the elements that are required under the service? Now, let's define this. Let's define, for example, one service, we have the DB, right? So under the service, you have one requirement. You should have at least one service, and that service must have at least an image defined. Now, you can only define one image per service. Of course, in Docker, you cannot say Docker run and press and put two images. Docker only take one image because it will use that image to spin a container. You cannot define two images under Docker. The same goes for service. So in a Docker compose file, you are going to have at minimum one service with one image. The maximum number of images you can have per service is actually one, right? Like I said here, of course, we need at least an image to spin a container. Why? Because of what I said earlier. Actually, a service is a container because a service called an image and Docker Compose, we use that image to actually spin the container. Now, let's go ahead and define another Docker Compose file. So we are going to call for the service. Now, the first service we are going to call DB. We will specify the image, which is actually the image that Docker Compose we use to actually spin the container, meaning that this service will be coming from Postgres, right? The image that we are calling here is Postgres. After that, we put restart. What is restart in Docker Compose? Restart is just telling Docker Compose that at launch time, when you are starting the container, if the container fail, attempt to restart it automatically. And Docker Compose will keep restarting the container, right? It doesn't mean, but you have to pay attention. This is only happen at launch time, like when you are launching the container. If you are launching the container, it fails. This flag called restart always, we always restart the container, right? We make sure that you keep restarting the container. But if your container start to run and after like 5-10 minutes, it fails, this will not be applicable no more because Docker only read this file at runtime, meaning that if your container runs for 5 minutes, then after 5 minutes it crashes, Docker Compose will not attempt to restart it. So this is only at runtime. And you can also have like restart, we have restart never, we have restart always, we have restart on failure. Restart never means that if the container fail, don't attempt to restart it, right? And restart always means that always restart if the container fail, right? Now, another option that we are going to see the host name. This is just to define the host name of the container. And when you set this, you say database, for example, if you actually exec in the container, you will see that the host name of the container is actually database. So host name, we pass here to set the host name to the container. That's same as hostname CTL. That you can use hostname CTL in like Ubuntu to set actually the host name of your virtual machine. You can use the flag host name actually to set the host name of the container. And with Docker, you can say docker run -h or -- host name to specify that. Now, another thing that we are going to see is the volume. That's how you can actually persist the volume inside the container, right? Whatever is here, this DB data is actually the volume that is located on your virtual machine. And this one here is actually the volume that is located inside your container. So that is how we persist the volume using Docker Compose. That's the same equivalent. And when we say Docker run -v, when we say Docker run -v, that's the same equivalent here. Another aspect that we are going to see is environment. This is how we define environment with Docker Compose. We define environment like this with Docker Compose. So that's the same as in Docker. For example, you are going to say Docker run -e, and you're going to specify our environment variable. If this was in Docker, we are going to say Docker run -e Postgres_db equal this Postgres_user. So we are going to define tray -e to go ahead and take all this into consideration. Another one will be expose. That's how we expose a port, right? But this is exposing port inside the container. So this is, for example, when you say docker run -p, if you say 80:54, this will be the equivalent of the 54. You can say docker run -p, for example, 80:5432. That's how we expose. Another one will be defining, like, for example, a second service. We call the image naturally, and that this time around, it is running nginx. Then we pass again our restart flag to tell Docker what to do with the container, just in case that container fail. Then we have hostname. Hostname here again will be to tell Docker what to do if, like, not what to do, like hostname here will be to actually set the host name of the container. Volume here, the same, to find a volume. When you talk about it now, port. This is how we expose, right? This is like port binding. This is the equivalent, like what it said, Docker run -p8080. This is how we expose port. So we pass the flag port in Docker Compose to actually bind port, right? This 80 here is actually the port that we open on our virtual machine. And this 80 here is actually the port that is inside the container. So we are binding these two ports together. That's the equivalent of Docker run -p8080. But in Docker Compose, we are going to call it ports. And remember, it is port with S. You need to put S. Also here, we say volumes, and it is volume here with S. Another thing that we are going to do is DB is like depends on. Now, sometime, for example, service. So depends on, we put depends on usually when a service depends on another. For example, here we say it depends on DB. And what is DB here? DB is the service. Which service? This service. This basically tells Docker Compose that the DB service need to start before the web service because the web service depends on the DB service. That's the meaning of that. So if you want to set dependency between services, you use the flag depends on. It is not depend -on. It is depend _on. Well, pay attention. It is not depend -on. It is depend _on. And we use that to set service dependency. Like here, the web service depends on the DB service, meaning the DB service we have to start first before the web service. Another thing that we are going to see, let's define another service here. So we are going to define Redis, same thing, the image. We are going to add restart. We are going to add a host name as usual. We are going to add a volume. We already know about this. Expose, like I said, this expose here is just the equivalent of, for example, exposing the port inside the container and not outside the container, right? Inside the container, and we use this port here to bind. Let's define another service. We have the image, we start, host name, volume, and expose. Now, you can expose multiple port. You can expose multiple port. And also you can bind into multiple port. So you can expose multiple port and you can bind into multiple port. Right. This Docker Compose is not complete. Then the reason is that because we have not declared anything yet. And in the next few minutes, I will demonstrate to you that this was not actually complete. Now, let's define another type of Docker Compose file. Set the version and the service. So we're going to have, for example, app. Let's define the image under it. Now we are going to have another element called workdir. So what workdir here is a working directory. That's just a default directory of the container. In Docker Compose, you can set the working directory as well. Same as when you are doing Docker run, you can say Docker run -w or -workdir to actually set the working directory, right? That's the equivalent of workdir also in the Docker file. So if you want to set a default working directory, you can also set that in Docker Compose by using the flag workdir. And here the workdir on this container was actually set to app. Another one is the entry point. We can set an entry point. So on Docker Compose, you can also set an entry point. Now, I want to specify something. Everything that you set on Docker Compose will override whatever was inside the image. Let's imagine that in this image nginx, the working directory was already specified, and meaning that, let's say the Docker Compose that was used to spin this nginx image, for example, had a workdir set and the entry point set. Docker Compose will override. So Docker Compose override anything that is under the image. Let's specify the volume here as well. Let's also specify the port. Like I said earlier, we can buy multiple port. We can buy multiple ports. Same as we can expose multiple port, we can buy multiple port. Let's add some environment variable, and then let's add some secret as well. And let's add some network. What is network here? So network, let's talk about secret first. Network in Docker Compose, secret first in Docker Compose is what we use to actually inject secret in the container. So to inject secret in the container, we use secret. Now network, to create a network and place the container inside the network, we use the network flag. And we can define multiple network in Docker Compose. So secret is actually to inject secret inside the container, and the network is actually creating a network that we are going to place the container inside. So that's the meaning. Good. Now, let's, for example, pay attention to this Docker Compose. Now, I want to give some special note here. I want to give some special note here. In Docker Compose, for you to have a Docker Compose file, you will need at least a service. So in the Docker Compose file, in terms of service, the minimum required is that you must have at least a service. So that's the minimum required. So the minimum required is that you must have at least a service. This is very important. Without a service, you don't have Docker, you're not going to have a Docker Compose file. Now, the next thing is that I want to also add, I already mentioned this, but I just want to reemphasize on that, is that the number of service is equal to the number of container, right? The number of service is actually equal to the number of containers. Now, let's compare Docker Compose with actually Dockerfile, because if you look at the end element that we said in Docker Compose earlier, we talk about expose, we talk about working there, we talk about entry point, for example, we talk about volume. So let's see what similarities we have between Docker Compose and actually Dockerfile. So let's have Docker Compose on the left, and let's have Dockerfile on the right. Now, in Docker Compose, for examples, let's start defining a service. Now, after the service, like you guys know, we are going to go ahead and define the image that will be used to spin that service, meaning that the image that will be used to spin the service. Here we are using nginx. So in Docker Compose, we are going to have nginx. If we were in Dockerfile, we are going to use from. In Dockerfile, we are going to say from nginx. So in your Docker Compose, when you say image nginx, that's just what you are saying, for example, the equivalent of from nginx. Now, the next thing that we are going to have is the working directory. In Dockerfile, we are going to say work dir. Another thing that we are going to have in Docker Compose is the volume. In Dockerfile, we are going to have volume. Another element that we are going to have in Docker Compose is expose. In Dockerfile, we are going to say expose. Another thing that we are going to have here will be environment. In Docker Compose, we are going to say env. And also, we are going to have the entry point. In Docker Compose, we are going to say entry point. Now, I want you to pay attention. If you pay attention between Docker Compose and Dockerfile, is that in Dockerfile, this element, work dir, volume, expose, environment, and entry point, they are actually in capital letter, but in Docker Compose, they are not. If you pay attention, in Docker Compose, you don't have any of this element in capital letter, but in Dockerfile, they are in capital letter. What does this mean to us? This means to us that you don't have, if you want to use Docker Compose, you may not specify everything in the Docker file, because you can still specify those elements in the Docker Compose file. For example, you may not specify in your Docker file, for example, work dir, because you can specify that your Docker Compose. You may not specify expose because you can specify that your Docker Compose. The same goes for volumes. The same goes for environment. The same goes for M support. But anything that was specified in your Docker file, if you if you go to Docker Compose and you set something different, that will override. Meaning that, for example, if my work gear on my Docker file is actually, let's say /DevOps, if I go on my Docker Compose and say working gear /app, that will actually override the /DevOps. So meaning that the Docker file, the Docker Compose will take precedence on the Docker file. Now, let's keep specifying a couple of elements. Couple of element that goes under the service. So let's call a service like DB. Specify image MySQL. Let's specify this element called command. So in Docker Compose also you can run command, right? In Docker Compose you can basically run command. Also, when you are starting a container, you can run that command, which is something that is beautiful. That's also the equivalent, like you can say Docker run -it Ubuntu and you say ls. That's just equivalent of that. Like we can run command using Docker run. It will run the command, and the Docker Compose we can do the same thing. So Docker Compose also have a flag called command. Another flag is the working there that we also know. Also, we have the volume that we're also familiar with. We have the environment variable that we are also familiar with. There's no limit on environment variable in Docker Compose. You can set as much as you want in terms of environment variable. Now, also secret, when you want to actually bake secret in, when you want to ingest secret inside the container, you can use secret. Now, network. In the network, you can also set an alias for the network. So you can create a network where the container will run and actually set an alias for that service, meaning that the service will be known by the alias name. The service will be known here by the alias name. So you can create a network and actually even set an alias. Now, let's go through a couple of elements that you can set on your services. And I want to emphasize that these elements are optional, meaning that you don't always have to use all of them. It is case by case. So it depends on what you are trying to do. For example, we have seen a lot of elements here, but it doesn't mean that in every single Docker Compose, you are going to have all those elements. So it will depend on what you have at hand. But most of the time, these are few elements. I haven't put all of them, but I put these are most important elements that you will need. Let's try to list those elements. The first one is command. We talk about command here. A command is just like when the container starts, the first command that you want, not the first command, when the container starts, the command that you want to run, you can specify that. We talk about restart, which actually tells Docker Compose how to restart the container. If you say restart always, Docker Compose will always restart the container, but this is just at runtime. I want to precise this. Then we have volume. If you want to actually persist volume, right? Especially for database, if you want to persist volume, or if you want like mount a file as a volume or mount it as a directory as a volume in the container, or persist a file or a directory in the virtual machine, you use volume. The next thing is network. If you want to create a network and actually place the container inside that network, you go ahead and use network. Or if you want to place the container in an existing network, you can also do that using driver. We shoot a next video for advanced Docker Compose where we go in deep with all the network drivers and all the volume driver. The next element is environment, where we want to create environment variable. And if you want to like expose the container, we go ahead and use expose. Also, if you want to bind the container so that we can go on the browser and maybe see the application running inside, we use port. Another one is depends on. If you want to kind of like a control or tell Docker Compose which service depend on what, we use the depends on. If you want to use like set like the host name, for example, for the container, we use host name. And if you want to give the container name, you can also give the container name. That's the equivalent of Docker run -- name. So with Docker Compose, you can also set the container name. And we are going to use the container underscore name and not container hyphen name. You will barely see flag in Docker Compose having hyphen. Most of the time it is underscore. Now, if you want to also set like a default working directory, like we mentioned earlier, you will go ahead and use work there. And also, if you can set an entry point, which is going to be the first command that Docker will run when the container start. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the declaration. Now we are done with the service. So far we cover the version, then we cover the service. Let's talk a little bit about the declaration. Now, the declaration, like I mentioned earlier, is optional. It depends. We will see in which case we need to use the declaration and in which case we don't have to use the declaration, right? It is optional, but it it might be mandatory. Let's see in which case we can use the declaration here. Now, let's construct, for example, a Docker Compose file with the version and the services using like the element that we covered earlier. So we can set a version and a service. Now let's add volumes. Now, if I add volume, I have to declare those volume, right? If I add volume, I have to declare those volume. And to declare those volume, I will go ahead and declare those volume here. Now, I want us to pay attention into few stuff here. As you can see, volume and volume, version, service, and volume here are the same level. The volume that you have here is not the volume that you have here, right? The volume that you have here is different. So usually we declare the volume here, and these are the volume that is inside our virtual machine, not inside the container. I mentioned earlier, this is the volume in the virtual machine, and this is the volume inside the container. So when we are declaring the volume, we only declare the volume that are inside our virtual machine. So we declare everything before the column and not after the column, right? Because after the column is actually inside the container. So because we call volume, we are going to go ahead and declare volume, but volume has to be at the same level with version and services. Now, also one thing that we can add is a network. And if we add a network, we have to go ahead and declare that network as well. Now, when you add a network, you come here and you declare it. Now, pay attention into how we declare the volume at the network. We are going to say volume, then we are going to declare those volume. Then we are going to say network, and we are going to declare those network. It is volume with S here, network with S here. And network, volume, version, and service are actually on the same level. So in Docker Compose, if you actually set the volume or the network in one or more of your service, you need to declare those volume and network. Secret, the same goes for secret. If you actually call secret, you have to go ahead and declare that secret. So if you, in one or more of your services, you declare a volume, you declare either a volume, either a network, or a service, or all of them, you will have to go ahead and declare them on the declaration portion. But if you don't declare something, you don't have to. If you didn't use something, let's say, for example, I didn't use volume, I will not have to declare any volume. Let's keep digging into the declaration portion. So let's construct again a simple Docker Compose file. As you guys can see here, we have a Docker Compose file. We have a version. It's made of one service. And on this service called app, we actually use volume, use network, and we use secret. That is why we came here. We declare the volume, we declare the network, and we declare the secret. And I want us to pay attention on the alignment. So like I mentioned earlier, version, service, the volume declaration, the network declaration, and the secret declaration has to be aligned. Then if you pay attention, for example, under volume, the volumes that you are declaring, they need to also have the same alignment. The network that you are declaring need to have the same alignment, and the service that you are declaring need to have the same alignment. So here we are defining my secret, and we are just basically telling Docker Compose which file he needs to use to consume those secrets, actually. Now, another aspect, so we keep digging into the declaration. Now, I want to say something very important here. Each time we have under the service, the network, the volume, the secret, we need to declare those. Each time we are using either the network, the volume, the secret, or all of them, or some of them, we need to go ahead and declare, right? It is mandatory. It is mandatory. Now, let's set some important fact, right? Let's set some important fact about Docker Compose. These facts are very important, and you have to understand and know exactly how they are. Now, in Docker Compose, port mapping should be unique, meaning that port mapping should be unique. For example, here I have two services, front-end and API. As you can see, I'm mapping 8080 with 80, then I'm mapping 8081 with 80. This is correct, but this is not correct. You cannot map two ports. It's the same. We are in the virtual machine. When a port is open on the virtual machine, that port can only be used once. If the first container binds to port 8080, the second container cannot bind to port 8080 again. That is why in Docker Compose, this is not allowed. So port mapping are unique, and you can only bind one container per port. So pay attention when you're writing the Docker Compose file. You can only bind into a single port at a time, one port at a time, for example. Now, the next thing is that the container name are unique. So container name are unique. The same thing in Docker, you cannot have two containers with the same name. For example, here you have the front-end. The front-end container is called front-end. The API container is called API. These two names are unique. Now, this is not allowed. You cannot have two containers with the same name. It's not going to work. Your first service cannot have container name frontend, and your second service you also have a container name frontend. They will not work. So container name are unique. Also, the service name are also unique. In Docker Compose, the service name are unique. If you have, for example, this Docker Compose file, the first service is called web server, the second service is called database. So these are unique, and this is correct. But this is not correct. You cannot have two services with the same name in Docker Compose. So it is not allowed. So also environment variable isolation. In Docker Compose, services consume, or let's say services use environment variable uniquely. Now, what does it mean? If I have a service called app1 and it is using this environment variable, I cannot claim that service called app2 will use the same environment variable, for example. So if two services use the same environment variable, you will have to put the two environment variable on every single services. So services does not exchange environment variable. Of course, you have one service. I said earlier that every single service will yield a container. If every single service will yield a container, container cannot exchange environment variable. So that is why if we have two or more services using the same environment variable, you have to go ahead and add those environment variable on every single service. Good. So now, another important fact is the volume mapping path, right? Another important part is the volume mapping path. For example, now, if you come here, I'm declaring this volume, right? I'm declaring this volume here. I'm mapping that here. And also, this is, for example, this is not allowed. Now, if I have a volume call, I need to declare it. This is correct. But if I call a volume, I don't declare it, it is not correct. So this is not correct because I call this volume, but I never declare it. But here, you see that I call the volume, but I actually declare it here. If you look at here's version, service, and volume are having the same alignment. Also, the network configuration. If you have a network, all right, if you call for the network, for example, this you can place one thing that I want to add is that you can place multiple container on the same network, right? Like you see here, we have network. The network here is called my network. The service 1 is placed on my network. The service 2 is also placed on my network. Then we have to come here and declare this network. Now, if you don't declare it, this is wrong because you are calling network that you never declare. And pay attention here, network, right? Network, service, and version actually have the same alignment, right? They actually have the same alignment. So version, service, and network should have the same alignment. Dependency management, right? Dependency management. Now, let's take, for example, this. This is correct. I have two services, the web and the DB. I'm saying that the web depends on the DB, meaning that Docker Compose need to start the DB service first before it start the web. Docker Compose does not follow the order that you put the service. Docker Compose will read this flag to know which service to start. Now, if it does not specify which service need to start first, Docker Compose will go ahead and start all the services at the same time, right? If you don't specify the order in which service need to start by passing this flag called depends on, Docker Compose will go ahead and start all the services at the same time. So this is correct because we are actually setting a dependency on the service that exists, but this is not correct here, all right? If I say web depends on the front-end service, as you guys can see on this file, there's no service called front-end. So this will fail because the front-end service does not exist. The web service cannot depend on a service that does not exist, right? And even if the front end, this service must exist before that that works. So even if you have another, if you have another Docker, if you have another Compose file having this front end service, it will not work. All of them have to be under the same Docker Compose file. So Docker Compose file are dependent, right? Let's say independent. Sorry, they are independent each other. Another important fact here, dependency management. I think we talked about this already. Now, by default, right? By default, let's now, we cover the version, we cover the service, we cover the declaration. Now, let's talk a little bit now about the Docker Compose file itself. Now, Docker Compose is called, Docker Compose uses a special file by default, right? By default, you can use docker-compose.yaml, or you can use docker-compose with YAML. But notice that you can either say .yaml using A or not using A, right? So this is .yaml, but this extension is mandatory. You must have this extension, either .yaml or without A, or .yaml with A. And if you want to go ahead and spin all containers, you will have to type this command, docker compose up -d. And notice that the Docker when you run this command, for example, Docker assume that either the Docker compose yam.yaml or the Docker compose.yaml file is actually located in the current directory. So when you run this command, Docker will assume that it is actually one of these files will be actually located in the current directory. So if the file is not there, Docker will go ahead and fail. Now, let's ask ourselves a question, right? What if we have a Docker compose file that is not located, for example, in our current directory? If we have a Docker file that is not located in our current directory, we have to specify the flag -f, right? So we say Docker compose -f, and we are going to go ahead and specify the file path, right? So we will tell him exactly the path where our compose file is actually located. This is, for example, the same when we are using Docker build. If you are using Docker build and your Docker file is not located in your current directory, you are going to say Docker build -f, and you're going to specify the path where your Docker file is. So this is the same technique. If the Docker compose file is not located in our current directory, we are going to go ahead and tell Docker compose exactly where it's located so that it can go ahead and run it. So this is just, for example, an example. Let's imagine that our compose file is located under home DevOps. So we will give him the complete path where the file is located. The same thing also. Now, another question that we may ask is that what if the Docker compose file is actually located in our current directory and has different name? Well, the Docker compose file, this is in the case where you have two Docker compose files, sorry. You will call the first Docker compose file Docker compose -yaml, for example, but you cannot use this. Two files cannot have the same name in Linux under the same location, right? So you might have to choose another name. If that's the case, you can still pass the flag -f, but you need to specify where the file is located. Let's say, for example, the file is called devops-compose.yaml. I will just pass the flag -f to specify that and give him the name of the file, right? I don't have to give him the complete path of the file, just the name of the file. And like I said, it is mandatory that you have this extension .yaml, right? This can either be .yml or YAML. Now, let's go through probably important command in Docker Compose. Now, to start service in Docker Compose, we are going to say Docker Compose up. This is the command that will be used to start service. Now, we can start service also in detached mode. We are going to say Docker Compose up -d, which we start service in detached mode. This is the equivalent of Docker run -itd or Docker run -d. So we can also start service in detached mode, just as we do in Docker. Another important command is that we can stop services, right? To stop services, we are going to say Docker compose down, right? If you want to stop services, we will say Docker compose down, and that we go ahead and stop services. I want you to pay attention each time it is Docker -compose, not Docker _compose or Docker compose in one word, right? It is Docker -compose down if you want to stop service. Now, if you want to stop, start, restart, for example, services or container, we can use either Docker compose stop, right? That will basically stop the container without killing the container. When you say Docker compose down, Docker will go ahead and kill all the container. But if you say Docker compose stop, Docker will just go ahead and stop the containers. Now, if you say Docker compose, when you stop the container, you can later on say Docker compose start to start those container, or you might restart container by saying Docker compose restart. And also we can, because Docker compose has multiple services, we can decide to actually deal with a particular service, right? If I want to start only one service, I'm going to say Docker compose start and pass the service name, right? And you can start multiple services, right? Let's say I have a Docker compose file with 10 services. I can decide to start only like 2 services. I will say Docker compose start and give the 2 service name, right? Like for example, here we say Docker compose, we have this compose file with 2 services, and we can decide to start only Redis container. We are going to say Docker compose start Redis. Also, we can exec into a Docker Compose. We can use Docker Compose to exec into a container, same as in Docker. So we are going to say Docker Compose exec, and we are going to pass the container name followed by the command. And for example, here, if we see this Docker Compose with two services, Redis and two services, sorry, DB, app and DB. If you want to exec inside DB, we are going to say Docker Compose exec Redis. And we can also use, you can say Docker Compose exec -it if you want to actually get inside. Now we can check the configuration. Sometime it is good, I always do this, to check the configuration first to make sure that the Docker Compose file is actually well configured before you start using it. You can actually check by saying Docker Compose config. When you say Docker Compose config, Docker will go ahead and check if the configuration, check the not the syntax, the formatting, check if the formatting is actually correct. You can say Docker Compose config, and that will validate and the config your config file, right? Which is here the Docker Compose file. We can also list containers using Docker Compose. We just have to say Docker Compose PS, same as in Docker. Good. Now let's compare, right? Let's compare Docker and Docker Compose command, because Docker and Docker Compose are very similar. Technically, if you are familiar with Docker command, it should be easy for you to be familiar with Docker Compose command, because most of the time, the only thing that change is Docker to Docker Compose. All the commands are the same, right? All the commands are the same. So let's dig into that and see what's up. So in Docker, for example, we are going to say Docker -itd run. I think there's a mistake here. It should be Docker run -itd. So this is a little typo. It should be Docker run -itd. In Docker Compose, we are going to say Docker Compose up -d, right? Another command in Docker, we are going to say Docker build, right? If we are trying, for example, to build images, we are going to say Docker build, and we pass the option and the path. In Docker Compose, we are going to say Docker Compose build. Of course, you can build images with Docker Compose as well. That will be part of the second video on Docker Compose for advanced. But this video is just for like basic, to get basic concepts so that we can understand what is Docker Compose, and also learn how to move with Docker Compose. Also, in Docker, we can say Docker stop to stop container. In Compose, we are going to say Docker Compose stop. In Docker, we are going to say Docker remove followed by the compose name. In Docker Compose, we are going to say Docker Compose down. In Docker, we are going to say Docker PS. And in Docker Compose, we are going to say Docker Compose PS. So Docker PS in Docker and Docker Compose PS in Docker Compose. In Docker also, if we want to exec in the container, we are going to say Docker exec. In Docker Compose, like we saw earlier, we're going to say Docker Compose exec. Also in Docker, we are going to say Docker stop. If you want to stop all containers, or like stop like all container at the same, all running container, or remove all container, we are going to say Docker stop or Docker rm and pass this command. In Docker Compose, we are going to say, let us go back. So in Docker Compose, we are just going to say Docker Compose down. Like I mentioned earlier, when you say Docker Compose down, it will go ahead and wipe out all containers. And it will only wipe out containers that's the beauty thing about Docker Compose. If you say Docker Compose down, Docker Compose will only delete containers that it actually created. Docker Compose does not delete container that it has not created. Docker Compose does not manage container that it has not created. So that's the beauty thing about Docker Compose. So you can say Docker Compose down without being afraid that maybe a container that you start with Docker or a container that you start with another Docker Compose file will be affected. Good. Some important fact also is that in Docker Compose command, right? Docker Compose command like high level command that works with the entire architecture as defined in the Docker Compose file. We can consist of many containers working together. But in Docker, right? Docker command are generally operate, right? You operate on individual container, image, and volume. So with Docker Compose, you can manage multiple container, like the Docker Compose command help you to manage multiple container. But in Docker, you can only manage a container at a time. Now it's part for hands-on. So let's go and it's part for hands-on. Let's go to the console and practice everything that we have seen so far. So we are going to deploy an application using Docker Compose, and we will go ahead and practice all the command that we have seen so far. Now let's jump on the terminal and practice. So here on my terminal, I have a sample Docker file. If I cut that Docker file, it is just a restaurant app, which is made of few services, the Yarrow UI, the app server, the Redis, and the DB here. So, which is 1, 2, 3, 4 services. So let's use this to practice Docker Compose command. Now, in Docker Compose, if I want to go ahead, for example, and pull all the images, for example, when I say pull all the images, if I want to go ahead and pull all the images that this Docker Compose file have, I'm going to say Docker-compose pull. It's going to pull all the images. Now it just tell me that all the images are already available here. So if I do Docker Compose pull, it will go ahead and pull all the images. So let's do Docker images. Let's do Docker compose images. It doesn't have no image. Let's try to check those image on Docker. I want to delete those images so that you guys see how it's going to pull. Now, if I do Docker, for example, remove images, -F, I'm going to go ahead and remove all these images. Docker images again. It's one that is left. Good. Now, if I do Docker Compose pull, that's going to go ahead and pull all the images. So you can pull all the images in your Docker Compose using Docker Compose pull. That basically will go pull all the images that you have, so that when you try to launch container, it doesn't have to pull those images no more. So as you guys can see now, it is pulling the images. It's already pulled the Redis server. Now it's pulling the DB, the app server, and the UI. It's almost done. The UI is already done. Now it's working on the app server. And everything is actually done. So now if I want to start all the services at once, I will go ahead and say Docker Compose up. But be careful, if I say Docker Compose up like this, it's going to start all the services, but it's going to jack the prompt to show me the log, right? For example, if I apply this, it will start all the services, but it will start showing me the log of all those services. So I will not be able to see the services. So actually, it has jacked the prompt, right? The prompt has been jacked, and it is showing me the log. Now, if you don't want to see this and you just want to start your services, you have to pass flag-D, which will stand for detach mode. Now it will start all the services without showing me the log. Now, so we start all the we use Docker pull to pull all the images in the Docker Compose file. We use Docker Compose up -D to actually start all the services. Now, if you want to see all the services, or if you want to list, for example, all the services, we have to say Docker Compose PS. It will show us all the services. So right now, it is showing us that we have 4 services, and we actually have the UI service, which is bind on port 80, for example. Now, also one thing that we can do is that we can stop these services, right? We can stop these services. Now, I want us to pay attention. So let's stop this service. If I can do Docker Compose stop, if we go ahead and just stop these services without removing the container, right? If I do Docker Compose stop, it will only stop these services. So let's give him a second to go ahead and stop, because he stopped container by container. It's done with the first one. I was going to hit the second one, the third one, and then the fourth one. So Docker Compose stop, we go ahead and stop the services. Now, if I do Docker Compose PS again, release, you will see that everything is there in the exit mode, meaning that it has stopped the services, but the container are still there. Now let's do Docker Compose up again to bring those services up. It's going to restart that. So as you can see, if I do Docker PS, they are all there. Now, if I want to remove all the service, I will go ahead and do Docker Compose down. Now, Docker Compose down will remove all the containers. Docker Compose stop, we only stop containers, but Docker Compose remove, Docker Compose down, we actually remove all the containers. So when it's done, we are going to type Docker PS to see what happened. Give him a second to kill all the containers. It's done. If we type Docker Compose PS, you will see any of the service, because it actually will go ahead and wipe out all the service. Now, let's go ahead and type Docker Compose up again to bring those services up. As you can see here also, it is creating the network before, right? Because we declare a network, and Docker Compose is actually creating this network before creating the containers, because you need to put the containers in the network. So it will create a network first before attempting to place container inside. So now Docker Compose PS, we have our service up. We can also restart, right? We can restart all this container by saying Docker Compose restart. It will restart. As you guys can see, it is restarting all the containers. If I say Docker Compose PS, it's there. Now, I can say also, if I want to check the configuration, for example, of my Docker Compose file, I will say Docker Compose config. Docker Compose config will check the configuration of my Docker Compose file. So it went ahead and checked the configuration of my Docker Compose file. Let me clear the screen. So this is the configuration of my Docker Compose file, right? This is, it catch any error. So this is telling me that there's no error so far on my configuration file, for example. Now, we can also remove, right? We can also remove containers, for example. We can also remove containers. So I can say Docker Compose, let's say Docker Compose PS, right? Then I can say Docker Compose remove, right? Sorry, I need to specify the container name. So I can say Docker Compose remove. Then I pass the container name. It's going to go ahead and remove the UI. So this Docker Compose remove. Let's give him this. So it's not seeing that as a container. I will do some digging in this, some digging on that command. Now, we can check the log, right? We can check the log also with Docker Compose. So we can say Docker Compose logs. It's going to go ahead and show us the logs of the container running. And here on the left side, it will give you the container, the service name, and it will show you the log. For example, for the app server, these are the log. For the DB, these are the logs. These are the log here. For example, for Redis, these are the log here. So this gives us all the logs of all containers, and it usually put different color. As you can see here, it went by color. We're showing the green color, the orange color, the blue color, right? So it goes by color so that we see the difference. For example, now One thing that we can also do is that we can check the version of Docker Compose that we are having by just typing Docker Compose version. So Docker Compose version, it will show us the version of Docker Compose that we are using, which is version 1.1.25. We can also exec into, if we type Docker Compose PS, we can also exec into, for example, one of the container, right? We can exec into one of the container using Docker Compose, as well. So Docker and Docker Compose, they are basically the same. If you are familiar with the Docker command, you just have to translate the Docker portion of that to Docker Compose. So this concludes this video. It was a pleasure having you guys around. I'm going to come again a month from now with another video on Docker Compose. That will be the 2.0, and I will try to go in depth with stuff like scaling, like show you how to scale a service. We go in depth on the network, for example, talking about all the type of network that we have. We go in depth on the volume, talking about all the type of volume that we have. Have a great day.